What did I miss? Brian here, and it's a little cloudy and the birds are pretty loud today. Hood is up because today we actually got a repair for the 4Runner, and that is changing out the crank front main seal. So I got an oil leak and it's behind the crank pulley. Something I never thought would happen to me, but here we are. And if we were to look further down, well, not really a good angle, but the crank pulley is starting to get coated in oil as well as behind it because of the bad seal. So we're going to have to change out that seal. Right here is a part number. It's Toyota OEM, and this is for the 4th gen 4Runners. I would assume that it will also work for the 2nd gen Tacomas and the FJ Cruisers ranging from 2007 to 2009. But it's always best to check with your VIN number. What's gonna happen is I'm gonna have to remove a lot of parts. I'm gonna have to remove the coolant reservoir tank, the fan shroud, the belt, the skid plates, and the crank pulley. That way I can access the crank seal, remove it, and replace it. Now, along with the crank seal, I'm also going to be changing out the crank pulley with a lightweight crank pulley. Now, I told myself not to do this because this would cause an oil leak, but I already have an oil leak, so it doesn't even matter at this point. It's by Nonstop Tuning, and it also came with a sleeve on the end, which is nice. For the tools, I'm using quite a bit. I'm using a steering wheel puller, a seal puller, a ball peen hammer, a torque wrench, a spinner wrench, a jack stands, a socket wrench, an extension, 4 sockets, which consists of a 10, 12, 13, and 14 millimeter sockets, 3 wrenches, which consists of 1 10mm wrench and 2 13mm wrenches, a breaker bar, a 22mm impact socket, 1/2 inch drive, and lastly, an impact gun, which, by the way, Henry, if you're watching this video, thank you very much for letting me use your impact gun. Your contribution is greatly appreciated. As for the materials, I'm using assembly lube, thread locker, the blue kind, degreaser, brushes, 2 bolts, and 4 nuts in these metric units. And so, without further ado, let's get to it. And I'm going to be switching over to the GoPro camera. To start off, I'm going to remove the coolant reservoir tank. Go ahead and remove the reservoir. Now I'm going to remove the bolts holding in the fan shroud. There's one on this side, and then on the driver's side there's that one. Can't forget, I have to also remove these fasteners. Usually they should be plastic clips, but I put metal fasteners on here because my plastic clips broke off. I'm only taking these out. I'm keeping the rest in because with these off, you could easily bend the plastic and pull the fan shroud out. Next, I'm going to remove the nuts holding in the fan, and there's a total of 4 nuts. There we go. Now I'm going to remove the belt as well as the water pump pulley. Okay, and the belt is out. Okay, removed a good majority of that stuff off. As you can see, that is the crank pulley. Now I'm going to lift it up, remove the skid plates, and put it on jack stands. Okay, it's on jack stands, and I also added bricks to the rear tires so it doesn't roll backwards. Now some water started pouring out. That's water, not coolant, but that's because last night I cleaned my engine, I rinsed it down, and some water started pouring out as I was lifting it up. But anyways, next thing I'm going to do is remove the skid plate. Okay. I'm underneath the 4Runner, and right there is the crank pulley, and I don't know if you could tell, but it's coated in oil. Even the timing marks to the right are coated in oil, and as well as the surrounding areas. Next thing I'm going to do is get the 2 bolts, 4 nuts, put it on the spinner wrench, connect it to the crank pulley, and then remove the bolt in the center. I'm going to take my spinner wrench, and I'm not going to use any of these bits because they will not fit onto the pulley. Instead, I got my 2 bolts and 4 nuts. I marked them with a black Sharpie because that's how far these bolts are going to go into the pulley. I put a nut at the very end of both bolts, and I'm going to slip them right through the spinner wrench. I got the 2 bolts in the spinner wrench, and I also have the nuts on both ends. And this is how it's going to work. I'm going to use my NST pulley to demonstrate. This is how it should look like when everything is all set up. And the idea behind this is that this will wedge against some part of the engine. In this case, it's going to wedge against the water pump, because when you undo the crank pulley bolt, it's just going to turn the crank pulley. So this prevents it from turning. That way you could take the bolt out. And look at the side, it's not touching the pulley, so it won't scratch it. Now, since it's going to be on the OEM pulley, it won't really matter. And when you look in the back, as you can see, the bolts basically are flushed with the back side of the pulley. Oh yeah. All right, bolt for the crank pulley is off. Next thing we need to do now is remove the crank pulley. All right, got the crank pulley off. Taking a closer look, you can see that is a lot of oil built up. We're gonna have to remove the old seal as well as clean up this area. Of course, want to be as careful as possible. Who knew removing a crank seal is gonna be this tedious? Okay, after what felt like forever, I finally got the old crank seal out. It was a lot tougher than I thought. And this is what we're left with. I'm gonna get out of the engine bay, and on the ground there is the OEM crank pulley, and there is the old crank seal, and it's all destroyed now. Here are the 2 seals. This is the old one that I just removed. This is the new one. The old one, destroyed, obviously had to be destroyed in order to be removed. As for the new one, brand new, not really much else I could say about it. But one thing I do want to point out is there's a little metal spring or a metal wire within the inner loop. You need to hold on to that, or at least I'm going to be holding on to it, because the old one has it as well. And then we've got the 2 crank pulleys. This is the OEM one I just pulled off, and this is the new non-stop tuning lightweight pulley. I got it in red to match my water pump pulley. This one, heavy, ridiculously heavy. Not really much else to say about it. And then this one, it's noticeably lighter. I'm gonna lift the OEM crank pulley and turn it to its side, but see that little indicator mark on the side of the pulley? This mark is needed to verify the timing. Like if you were to do a timing chain replacement, this mark is on here, but on the non-stop tuning pulley, the mark is not there. So we're gonna have to add a mark. It's gonna suck having to carve into this new pulley, but you know, that mark is there for a reason. I'm gonna stack the pulleys on top of each other. I'm gonna align the keyways with each other. That way it's easy to find the marks and carve it in. Okay, this is where I marked it on the NST pulley. Now we get to carving. And we're done. Like I said, it hurts, but it's there for a reason. Okay, now comes the part where I add in the new crank seal as well as the new crank pulley. But before I do that, I'm gonna clean the engine since it's coated in oil. And And it looks much better now. Next, I'm going to add in the new crank seal. Before I do, I'm gonna add a little bit of assembly oil, then I could tap it in. Okay, just want to make sure that it bottoms out and it's flush with the block, and sure enough it is. Next I'm going to add the new lightweight pulley. I already added some assembly lube inside as well as on the sleeve. Okay, new crank seal is in, new lightweight pulley is in, and it's torqued down. Now all that is left to do is to put everything back together. But first, here is before and after. Alright, everything is almost assembled. Let's take one last look at that crank pulley. It's looking good, just like that water pump pulley. The crank seal has been replaced. The crank pulley has been replaced with a lightweight one. Everything is assembled. The coolant reservoir tank, the fan shroud, and the fan are back in the engine bay. Though, I kept the skid plate off because I'm gonna start the engine and see if there are any oil leaks. I'm gonna start the engine to see if there are any oil leaks and to see if there are any check engine lights. Shouldn't have any check engine lights, but you never know. Here we go. Looking at that crank pulley, it's looking good, by the way. I'm not seeing any oil leaking from behind it, but I'm gonna give it some more time just in case if it leaks very, very gradually. Then looking at the dashboard, I got the door opening light and the flashing seatbelt light, but I don't have any check engine lights, which is good. So it's been 3 months since I changed out the crank seal as well as the crank pulley, and I had to do some very long-term extensive testing. I'm going to start off with the reliability. Does it affect the reliability of the engine? Not necessarily, at least not from what I'm seeing as of right now. The engine still starts up, it revs smoothly. In fact, it revs a little bit smoother than before. The OEM crank pulley is also known as either a harmonic dampener or a harmonic balancer. There's a little bit of rubber in between the two metal parts of the crank pulley, and that rubber helps absorb any vibrations within the engine, or at least whenever the crankshaft is turning. And if you replace it with a lightweight crank pulley, supposedly it could cause some internal vibrations within the engine and ruin it, which is not good. So far, I haven't had any issues, though I did feel a little bit nervous because of all the problems it could cause. But I met up with a 4Runner and a Tacoma owner who both have the NST crank pulleys. They say they've been running theirs for several years, so that makes me feel a lot better installing it. And most importantly, no oil leaks either, which is very good. As for the performance, the 4Runner is a little bit quicker. Not very much, but it's got a little more pep to it now. Whenever I added the JBA short type headers, it made the 4Runner noticeably quicker. And I feel like with the lightweight crank pulley, it's the cherry on top. It revs smoother, it's a bit quicker, and I don't have to put as much effort on the gas pedal for it to get up and go. Though, there's also the lightweight water pump pulley to take into consideration. I changed it last year whenever I replaced the belt, but I kept the crank pulley stock, which you're not going to see any gains, or very little if you see any. Most of the load is on the crank pulley, and now since I did replace the crank pulley and I now have 2 lightweight pulleys, there's definitely an improvement. And lastly, let's see how it looks from under the 4Runner. Okay, we're under the 4Runner. That is the lightweight crank pulley, and if you look in the surrounding areas, there is no oil. So that tells me 1, we fixed the oil leak, and 2, the lightweight crank pulley is not causing an oil leak, which is very good. I also checked above the crank pulley as well as through the holes in the middle of the pulley, and still I don't see any oil, so we are good to go. I'm gonna get up for this one, but that is it for this video. That is how you change the front main seal as well as the crank pulley. If you're subscribed, thanks. If you're not, thanks for taking the time to watch this video. I'm gonna clean up and lower it back down, but take care everyone. I'll catch you on the flip side.